No one had to teach me how to be angry. Like every child born, I cried out in protest against the indignity of being evicted from my mother's womb and brought into this world. We all know anger. Anger is sometimes useful because it reminds us that things in this world aren't the way that they should be. Whether it's a baby communicating that it's been far too long since his last top-up, or the victim of a crime whose anger testifies that what happened to her is not what should happen. Anger is a natural response to those who live in a broken world. This is why I've chosen the term wrath instead of the alternative anger as we look at the next of the deadly sins, because not all anger is sin, but all of it that turns into wrath is. Anger is a powerful emotion that has its uses. It's even something we occasionally see in the life of Jesus. Yet unless it's used for the right purposes and in the right ways, and unless it's processed in a timely fashion, anger can be destructive in our lives and in the lives of the people close to us. Imagine a young newlywed woman whose life is turned upside down when her husband has a medical emergency that requires her to take him to the emergency room. There, he has a serious but not life-threatening problem until a doctor makes a careless mistake and he dies as a result. Now, the anger that she experiences is a natural part of the grieving process, which we all have to go through in order to find wholeness after we suffer great loss. Her anger testifies to the depth of her affection for the husband that she lost. But over time, if she holds on to that anger, it metastasizes into something like wrath. She may begin to hate not just the person responsible, that in and of itself is a problem, but also those she begins to associate with them. Oh, all doctors are lazy, wicked people always looking out for themselves instead of their patients. Of course, the bitterness won't confine itself just to her opinion of doctors. In the long term, holding on to anger makes it a part of her identity, and it starts coming out in all of her relationships. Paradoxically, it can feel nice to nurse a grudge. Even while doing so, starts to wreck our lives. And in the end, she's so consumed by anger that she's unable to experience peace or joy. Now, anger is sometimes useful and appropriate, but if not dealt with correctly, it can be poison. Why does anger even exist? I mean, it's not an essential part of God's creation, like goodness and beauty. After all, if we lived in a perfect world, there would be no reason to experience anger. Rather, anger grows out of the conflict between our desire to see justice done on one hand and the reality that justice isn't done on the other. Anger in its purest form is a recognition that something ought to be that isn't, or ought not to be that is. Anger is a passionate response designed to motivate people to action so that we can do whatever is in our power to set it right. We see this kind of anger on display in the life of Jesus. Lazarus, Jesus' dear friend, has just died, and Jesus and his disciples go to comfort Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters. We pick up the story in John 11:32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Now, in the original Greek, these words, deeply moved and struggle, indicate that Jesus was angry. Some commentators think that Jesus is angry at Mary and Martha because they lack faith that he will raise Lazarus from the dead. But of course, Jesus doesn't go around raising everybody from the dead, so it doesn't make sense to me that that would be their expectation and that Jesus is angry at them for not having that. Rather, Jesus is angry because his dear friend's death serves as one more reminder of the terrible cost that sin imposes on the world. He's angry, but he's angry at sin and death, and that anger drives him to action. Now, of course, while we are powerless against death, Jesus is not. And we know that the story goes on where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. He walks out of the tomb alive and well. Jesus' actions show us what anger can look like, but that's not usually what it does look like. Well, anger has a place in the life of everyone who lives in a broken world. Our responses to the brokenness are often broken. So often anger that we experience isn't productive, like the anger we see in the life of Jesus, but rather destructive, like the anger we see demonstrated in the life of the woman in the opening illustration. The first way we become hurt by anger is when we hold on to it for too long. As we've seen, in the short term, anger can be helpful, but in the long term, it's not. Anger is somewhat similar to our adrenaline response. Our adrenaline response to stress is very useful because it can give us an almost instantaneous boost in strength and speed in dangerous situations where that can make the difference between life and death, like fleeing from a burning building. But our bodies aren't really all that discerning about when it's appropriate to use adrenaline. And if we experience chronic stress, like at a stressful work environment, our bodies can release small amounts of it over long periods of time, causing gastrointestinal problems, panic attacks, and even cardiovascular disease. So like adrenaline, anger can be useful as an occasional short-term thing, but as a chronic condition, it becomes destructive. When things are legitimately wrong, anger can lead us to constructive action. But when we allow anger to hang out past its best before date, it gnaws at us in unhelpful ways. Paul briefly touches on this in Ephesians 4:26 and 27, where he says, "In your anger do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." Now, a literal reading of the Greek here is not, "In your anger do not sin." It's, "Be angry and don't sin." Notice Paul is not forbidding anger, but he is stressing the need to be careful with it. He tells us to deal with it before the sun goes down, a metaphorical way of saying that we ought to deal with it as quickly as is practically possible. Because if we don't, if we hold on to it, it festers, giving Satan a foothold, meaning it gives him an easy opportunity to lead us into that distorted version of anger. Now, when we're dealing with anger, timing is crucial. When we're first made angry, responding immediately might not be advisable. In our passion, we may not respond proportionately, or we may say something hurtful that we can't walk back. But if we wait too long, we become attached to the offense, wanting to feel the anger more than wanting to be reconciled. So I recommend actively working to calm down, doing the same sorts of things that we tell our children when they're struggling to control their feelings. Take deep breaths, count to 10, withdraw from the situation so that you can get some perspective. But we need to do so not with an eye to avoiding the conflict, but with a commitment to resolving the conflict as soon as we are calm. Let's say I'm at a dinner party and someone says something about me or my wife or my kids that really upsets me. My immediate, unconsidered response might be to say something hurtful to the person who upset me. That's not helpful. So maybe I need to bite my tongue or excuse myself for a few minutes so that I can calm down. Maybe after dinner, I can ask the person for a word and in private and express my feelings. I can tell them how what he said made me feel. Now, that's no guarantee that the person will realize the error of their ways and ask for forgiveness. Of course, if they do, we ought to be willing to offer it. However, if I'm unable to convince that person after doing what is in my power to be reconciled to them, I need to be prepared to let the anger go, or it will certainly evolve in unhelpful ways. Just because my anger is based on a genuine grievance doesn't mean that I am right to hold on to it. Doing so doesn't help resolve the underlying conflict, it just embitters me. Of course, not all anger is based on legitimate grievance. Anger can be based on ignorant assumptions. So Hitler's unfounded assumptions about the wickedness of international Jewry led to a lot of anger over imagined transgressions rather than real ones. But often anger can stem from a place of pride and selfishness. People may be angered when the things that they want to have happen don't happen. Maybe it's someone who has an eye on that promotion at work and they get passed over and somebody else gets the job. Not everybody who's been in such a situation can objectively weigh the value of the other worker compared to them. Rather, they're being angry because things didn't unfold in the way that they had hoped. Other examples might be a man who is pursuing a woman and she decides that she'd rather be with somebody else. Or a person who eyes that last parking spot in the parking lot and is trying to get there when somebody else gets there first. Or the child who's angry because their friend got something for Christmas that they wanted and they didn't get it. This kind of anger isn't rational, but it is very real. Anger based on not getting what we want happens because we become obsessed with our own desires, so much so that we devalue the needs and desires of other people. I think I should get what I want, even if that means you don't get what you want. In other words, this kind of anger isn't rooted in justice or love, but in selfishness. But we're all susceptible to it. If we honestly examine ourselves and realize that we are experiencing this kind of petty anger, well, that self-discovery can actually be a way of growing in a new way of thinking about others. When I'm angered because I don't get what I want, I can consider other people's perspective. Maybe I didn't get what they wanted, but maybe they got what they needed. That person gets the parking spot that I wanted, and I could be angry about it, but then I can also take a step back and say that they needed a place to park too. And and I wouldn't think they would be justified in being angry at me if I got there first. So if I see that I'm angry and I'm from not getting what I want, it's an invitation to think about what others need and want too. Our unresolved anger can lead to bitterness, but Jesus points to an even greater danger. In Matthew 5, starting in verse 21, he says, "You've heard that it was said to people long ago, 'You shall not murder,' and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' which means you empty head, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' is in danger of the fire of hell." The Jews in Jesus' time understood the severity of murder, but thought that anger wasn't such a big deal. Jesus is saying that unresolved anger leads to contempt, which is the first step on a journey towards murder. When we don't feel or deal with our anger, it distorts our sense of right and wrong. A person who thinks violence is wrong may be willing to make exceptions for the kind of person that they're really, really angry at. Right now, for example, in the United States, there's an alarmingly high number of people who feel that violence may be necessary against those with whom they have political disagreements. The hyper-partisanship of American politics, reinforced by a media ecosystem that profits from exacerbating conflicts between people, transforms those with whom I have a disagreement into those against whom it may be excusable to use violence. Tyler Robinson, the man who's been accused of assassinating Republican political activist Charlie Kirk in September, was convinced that he was standing up against hate. And on the other side, Vance Bolter, the man who is accused of shooting two Democratic Minnesota state lawmakers and their spouses this past summer, seems to have done it because he thought he was standing up for the rights of the unborn. Wrath makes us feel justified in our hatred and contempt to other people, and when taken to its extreme, it can lead us to rationalize even something as serious as murder. This shows us that dealing decisively with anger is tremendously important. Now, as with each of the deadly sins, there is a corresponding virtue that can help us unwind the damage done by the sin. And in the case of wrath, the corresponding virtue is forgiveness. If we learn to forgive the people around us, we will resist the seductive appeal of wrath. But before we can discuss the power of forgiveness, we need to clean up some misconceptions about what it is or is not. Forgiveness is not an admission that the wrong done to us didn't matter. Some victims of sin are reluctant to offer forgiveness to those who sinned against them because they feel like it delegitimizes the pain that they're experiencing, letting the perpetrator off the hook while leaving them staggering under the weight of the consequences. But this misunderstands what forgiveness is about. God is deeply bothered by sin. When he asks us to forgive, though, he doesn't mean to say that what the person did to us didn't matter. He is more offended at the sin done to me than I am. Rather, he is asking us to trust his judgment. Trusting his judgment means that we recognize that we don't have all the facts, that we can't be entirely objective when somebody else has wronged us, and that we don't have the wisdom to decide what the appropriate consequences ought to be. We're saying, God, you see this situation clearly, and I don't. And you see the possibilities of redemption, and I can't. So I leave it up to you to decide how best to deal with this sin. In God's wisdom, he judges. In ours, we might not be satisfied with that judgment, but we must remember that we cannot ask God to be merciful towards us while demanding that he show no mercy to the person who sins against us. This is why Jesus ties offering forgiveness with receiving it when he tells us to pray, forgive us our trespasses as, meaning in the manner, that we forgive those who trespass against us. Now, we won't understand forgiveness fully by talking about it in an abstract sense. We need to see it lived, which is precisely what happens in the life of Jesus. If there was ever a reason for legitimate anger, it was in the way that Jesus was treated on Good Friday. Jesus is the incarnation of Israel's God, Emmanuel, God with us. Yet the religious leaders, the ones who should be most desiring to see him come, are the ones who are opposed to his ministry. In the name of righteousness, they condemn the righteous one to death. How might God respond to this conflict? Well, if God were like you and I, it would be very different. If people wanted to kill our children while pretending to be our friends, we would be furious. I dare say if they cruelly killed our children and we had the power of God, we might be coming up with imaginative ways to humiliate, torture, and kill them. But the point is that God isn't like us. He responds in a way that seems totally alien to us. How does God respond? Well, first, Jesus pleads with the Father to forgive those responsible for his death. In Luke 23:33 and 34, it says, when they came to the place of the skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. The soldiers have just driven giant spikes into Jesus' hands and feet, and his first concern is that God forgive the people who did that to him. Now, Jesus tells us that if we ask the Father for something according to the Father's will, and Jesus is always perfectly aligned with the Father's will, that God will do it for us, so we can have confidence that God granted that request. But beyond just forgiving those who are responsible, he uses the whole unjust affair to bring salvation to the world. God uses humanity's collective act of disobedience in crucifying the righteous one as the way of bringing salvation to all. As Isaiah the prophet said, looking forward to Israel's redemption, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds, we are healed. We did this to Jesus, but God doesn't use it as grounds to condemn us, but instead uses it to save us. If God loves the world, and even his enemies in this way, how does this shape our understanding of the call of God to his children? In some ways, this may be Jesus' most challenging teaching. He explains how we should imitate what he is about to go on and do for us on the cross. In Luke 6:27-36, it says this, but to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks of you. And if anyone takes what belongs to you, don't demand it back. Do to others as you'd have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that to those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that for you? Even sinners lend to sinners expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies. Do good to them. Lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High God, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Wrath teaches us to give to our enemies worse than we get. Forgiveness, as Jesus demonstrates, means responding with good towards evil. This is Jesus' most fundamental teaching because it encapsulates everything that Jesus did for us. He loves us, setting aside his own life so that we can have life, even though we were acting as his enemies. We show that we are God's followers by imitating God's posture towards sinners. This can happen in grand gestures like Jesus on the cross, but it also happens in the little things. Imagine that you have a neighbor who's just a jerk to you. Maybe he consistently stays up late at night blasting his music, and when you go and try to address it with him respectfully, he becomes verbally abusive to you. Maybe he's got a dog that does his business on your front lawn, and he doesn't clean it up. And you go to him and say, hey, just saying, could you please clean that up? And now, instead of cleaning that up, he makes sure that his dog always does his business on your front lawn. Not the kind of neighbor any of us wants to have. But what if you bake cookies for that neighbor and send him a Christmas card? Or what if you offer to help dig out the end of his driveway when the snowplow fills it in just as he's about to leave for work? Now, your neighbor might be suspicious, wondering if the cookies are laced with laxatives or something, but your kindness in the face of hostility will probably cause them to consider their responses. Your kindness is a way of saying, I'm not going to lower myself to your level, but I'm also not going to treat you as if you're irredeemable. By choosing to respond to hostility in this Christ-like way, I provoke the right sort of questions, like, why is this person being kind to me? And why are they responding to me so differently than I would expect? By disciplining ourselves to respond to anger with love, we avoid the temptation to fall into wrath. And our behavior can have the added benefit of breaking the cycle of escalation. Because conflict normally escalates. Maybe it starts with somebody who said something insensitive or did something inconsiderate, or begins with a misunderstanding, and the person who is offended receives the other person's behavior as hostility and then responds with hostility of their own. And the first person feels that this is unwarranted towards them, and so they respond with hostility of their own. And when we're angry, our sense of proportionality is completely thrown out the window, so every time that hot potato of hostility changes hands, it gets bigger and heavier until a conflict that may have started over something small takes on a whole life of its own. When we refuse to respond to hostility with hostility, we break the cycle. This keeps the small conflict from developing into larger, even devastating conflicts. Imagine if, in 1914, the Austrian emperor had chosen to de-escalate rather than escalate the conflict with Serbia surrounding the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. For the Austrians, swallowing their pride could be very hard. But the destruction of millions of lives in World War I and its aftermath could possibly have been avoided. Instead, wrath led to escalation, as it always tends to do, and the world experienced a spasm of violence whose consequences still resonate with us today, 110 years later. If we think that the way of wrath is appropriate, we can just look at that example and count the cost of not breaking the cycle of unresolved anger. So to summarize all of this, anger is a useful tool in a world that is broken. It gives us passion to correct injustice and to restore broken relationships, but its power means that it must be managed with tremendous care, or else it will be allowed to transform into wrath. This unresolved anger makes us bitter and causes us to dehumanize others until our sense of right and wrong is so warped by it that we can even justify something as serious as murder. In order to keep wrath from destroying us, we need to cultivate the value of forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't deny the seriousness of what's been done to you, but it leaves it up to God to decide how best to respond to it according to His grace. Forgiveness is how God operates in the world. As we clearly see in the example of Jesus, the call of the Christian is to imitate God's posture of forgiveness towards those who sin against us. When we live by forgiveness, we reveal God to the world. And we break the cycle of violence and hostility that causes so much harm in our world. So are you angry today? Are you holding a grudge? There's a perverse delight to it, but even as you hold on to that, it is poisoning your soul.
God is calling us to find freedom that comes from laying down our need for revenge and instead embracing the way of the cross, the way of forgiveness.